Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to call the Finance and Risk Management Committee meeting of San Diego Community Power on June 6th to order. Noting that Director LaCava, Director Kimura is here, and Director Mayor Dedina is not present this afternoon. Any public comment?
There are no public comments.
Thank you, Kimberly. Anything to add or withdraw from the agenda from staff?
You're muted, Eric, but that would be a no from staff.
I'm muted, no. Very good. Thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to item 1, Treasurer's Report for period ending 4/30/22. Dr. Washington.
Thank you, Chair Kumara. I am presenting the Treasurer's Report for the period ending April 30th, 2022. For the most part, we remained in a favorable, stable position relative to our actual financials compared to our budget. It is noted that operating revenue was off from the budget just over 1%, and that was pretty much centered in a billing timing differential from the time the billings are sent to our billing validation consultant and the actual billing and receipts of those collections from those billings. That's the differential, and the 1% below budget as it relates to the net operating revenue. Operating expenses, however, outperformed the budget primarily because of the hedging activity from our power services team. The power services team continues to procure energy using a dollar cost averaging approach, and that lessens the impact of the actual cost of power as it relates to the forward curves, which is with the current price, market price of the energy. So we were able to recognize some savings in that particular, in overall expenses, primarily related to the cost of energy, which supports the notion of an improved net position year to date through April 30th compared to our budget, which more than offsets the reduction in revenue as it relates to the budget for the period. The graphic below, of course, is just a graphic depiction of the operating revenues as it relates to expenses, and then ultimately where we land at a net position year to date through April 2022. Next slide, Kimberly. This graphic and table is a comparative analysis between our actual results as relates to our projections or pro forma year to date for the period, which pretty much aligns with the results from the budget, again, with the net operating revenue being slightly lower than the projection, again, as that relates to the billing differential that I previously referred to. Operating expenses, again, due to the hedging activity, we're able to mitigate some of the forward market costs of energy on the unhedged portion of our energy portfolio as we can continue to fill those buckets as we continue to procure energy. And again, with a favorable position compared to the projected net position relative to where we actually landed for the year-to-date period through April. And Chair Kimura, I will pass it back over to you if there's any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. Any questions for staff?
No, I'll just say thank you again. Appreciate it. Keeping a tight rein on the revenues and the expenses. Appreciate the monthly reporting. With that, I'll move the staff recommendation, which I think is just to accept and file, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you very much. Consider the report received and filed. Okay, next item on the agenda is the FY23 operating budget.
Yes, thanks again, Chair Humara. So I am presenting what we've developed to be our final draft of the operating budget to go forward to the board for final approval. So the request here, I'm seeking approval from the FRMC to recommend approval by the board of the budget for fiscal year 2023. Next slide, Kimberly. So this slide is a familiar slide. Again, it just overlays the budget development process that we've implemented that actually starts in January with the finance team putting all the infrastructure, all the framework around the budgeting process for the fiscal period. Next slide, Kimberly. This slide is also relatively familiar based on what we presented at the previous board meeting, just to really highlight some of the budget items that we're bringing forward to fiscal year 2023. We're looking to launch and bring online some programs during the period which we allocated portions of the budget to support. We are really excited to be approaching phase 4 when we bring on the County of San Diego, as well as the City of National City during the next fiscal period. Continued efforts in outreaching into the community, building advertising so that our customers are informed and aware of San Diego Community Power. And then, of course, we continue to monitor and track the cost of energy, which continues to escalate again with our hedging strategies, and continuing to procure energy is a way for us to mitigate the impact or the implications of those forward curve prices or current market prices as it relates to the cost of energy. Next slide, Kimberly. So I wanted to pause for just a moment, just to highlight some of the changes from the budget that was prefaced at the board meeting as it relates to what we're bringing forward now as our final draft of the budget to be discussed further. Some of the changes. So the revenue was increased due to a reduction of the ERA because of the increasing energy costs. Going down to the energy cost line item, as you can see, those, the net revenue and the cost of energy pretty much offsets one another as it relates of the action taken as it relates to the ERA. Interest and related expenses, that is reduced by $5 million, primarily because we've got funds allocated in a restricted account that directly ties in to the reduction of debt that was presented and proposed at the preliminary budget review at our last board meeting. Professional services, a small amount that was reallocated from the professional services and consulting line item in the budget to directly align with the purpose and the services that will be provided by that consultant as relates to programs. So that's a change, with a net total reduction in the total budget as it relates to fiscal year 2023 to just under $5 million. Next slide, Kimberly. So again, high level, this is categorically how the budget will fall out with gross revenue taken into consideration, a 1% of gross revenue for uncollectible accounts. Although we haven't experienced any significant collections at this point, but based on historic data provided by one of our key consultants, Pacific Energy Advisors, who typically, based on historic data, would allocate half of 1%, but we've opted to take a more conservative posture as we ramp on phase 3 at 1%. Again, the cost of energy is reflected as it compares to our previous budget, with total operating expenses, and then of course with the debt service reduction, pretty much centered in the interest that's being paid on our current credit facility, as well as interest being paid on the 2 notes that we're looking to actually pay off during this fiscal period, improving our net position to $14.1 million as opposed to $9.2 that we previously presented or previewed in the budget at the May board meeting as a result of the reallocation of the funds to pay off the notes that we're looking to liquidate in fiscal year 2023, given the fact that that payoff will be funded through restricted funds that we currently already have in place, and it will not be an allocation or a distribution for all intents and purposes from our budget. Next slide, Kimberly. Key assumptions that were presented at the May board meeting pretty much are the same and aligned, with the exception of the removal of the ERA as it relates to energy costs. Again, the opt-out rates are assumed to be 5%. We anticipate the Power 100 contribution to revenue to increase to 7% for the fiscal period. Again, uncollectible accounts believed to be conservative at 1% of gross revenue. And then, of course, the ramp on of phase 4 during the fiscal year 2023. Next slide, Kimberly. Cost of energy, as I alluded to previously, continues to increase based on the forward curves data that's reviewed and implemented and incorporated into our projections. At the board meeting, it was pointed out that energy between February and May was up about 7%, dollar for dollar, 44.1 million. And then between May and, of course, June, with that most recent update, which informs the budget, is up an additional 3.1%. And again, that's all driven by the forward curves, prices, and what's occurring in the cost of energy sector, which continues to drive the costs up. Next slide, Kimberly. Again, high level, where we'll land in terms of these key budget items: revenue, cost of energy, personnel costs, market and outreach costs, general administrative expenses, programs, and then interest and related expenses. So these in the next slide will break down further, albeit it's relatively difficult to see those amounts in the slide. However, it is attached to the package, not only with the detailed breakdown of each of these expense categories, but also with narrative to support what's occurring with each of these categories and the underlying line items. Next slide, Kimberly. So this is a slide that I was referring to. I'm not quite sure how that shows up on your end, but it's really, I can only imagine it's pretty difficult to see. The previous slide, again, broke down categorically those costs. This is a more detailed breakdown of those underlying subline items under those overarching categories, with the net position landing us at about 14.1 million for the fiscal year 2023. Next slide, Kimberly. This slide may look familiar from the board meeting. Again, we wanted to do sort of a comparative analysis of how we measured up with other CCAs, most similar with the Clean Power Alliance, based on the number of accounts seem to be most similar to our situation. As you can see, with the cost of energy being pretty much aligned with Clean Power Alliance at 93% of gross revenue. Next slide, Kimberly. So again, the ask here is a recommendation from the Finance and Risk Management Committee for approval to advance this to the board for final approval of the fiscal year 2023 operating budget. So with that, Chair Humora, I will pass it back over to you.
Thank you. Just a question on the net position. Do we track that as a reserve somewhere?
Yes, that is, that'll land as a contribution to our reserve as we continue to accumulate a reserve over time. So that'll be the contribution as a result of the fiscal year 2023 budget.
And I see you're estimating we're going to finish with about 36 million in the reserves for FY22 as well.
That's correct. So the 14 million would be a contribution to that reserve position.
If possible, I would suggest and recommend, if Councilmember LaCava agrees, that we list the reserves somewhere so we can see those on an ongoing basis.
Thanks for the feedback, Chair Moore. We'll incorporate.
Just a really important number that we're always tracking and critical to our success, that we maintain healthy reserves.
Yeah,
understood.
That was my only questions or comments. Councilmember LaCava?
Yeah, it's a nice segue for me. I would agree. I'm not as comfortable with the budget being presented in kind of a cash flow way. I don't, government budgets typically look a little bit different and would show the allocation of all the dollars as Chair Humora said. You would not show a change in that position, but you would show where that 14 million or so was going to go. And I think the narrative attached was appreciated, but I think for us to really, so I think you're doing great work. I'm not really going to challenge any numbers you have here, Dr. Washington. Let me start out with that. But I think in terms of us doing our due diligence, in terms of approving, we're up to $750 million now, getting a little serious here as we roll out all our phases to have a little more detail so that we can see how all the pieces are coming together to come up in support of these numbers. As you suggested, a lot of these line items are pretty straightforward. But for example, the assumptions that went in terms of when phase 4 would roll out, when we actually predict that would start, when the revenue would come in from phase 4, how we're looking in the first 3 phases. I think an explanation that I think you mentioned here, but was not in the backup, I could be wrong, that the 1% of uncollectibles is actually double what most CCAs have. I think we ought to mention that, and even to a certain degree, the footnote that this is 1% of revenue. It's not 1% of the customers kind of thing, because there's been a lot of media attention there. So I appreciate that differentiation. But I think as the organization matures, and you've done an incredible ramp up from 0 to where we are today, so I want to acknowledge that, always acknowledge that. But I think if we can start to build a more complete budget, not only to what Chair Humora said in terms of saying where that 14 million goes, but also identifying what debt it is we're carrying, that you've allocated the 1.3 million interest expenses, that we're having a little bit better understanding of the revenue and the cost of energy, since we're still in this transition period with phases. I don't know how much of that is, what's the word I want? I don't want, not confidential, but privileged information, because obviously we're going to be negotiating other purchase power agreements that, and I don't know. Let me ask you the question: how much of that do we disclose publicly once we reach the purchase power agreements? Is that publicly available?
For the most part, I don't believe so. And I don't know, Ryan, maybe you can chime in here. And Byron, our Power Services Director, is actually not joining us on the call today. But because of the details that are in those agreements, it could expose proprietary information that might not be supportive of our negotiations going forward. So that's why that disclosure in a public setting is relatively small outside of the total cost.
Well, and this is Ryan. I'm glad to weigh in on that as well. And I'm sorry my video turned off. I'm having Cox upgrades in my neighborhood. the specific price and location and other terms that are considered, quote, market sensitive information by the Public Utilities Commission are confidential in the first 3 years of the contract. So the agency can disclose, aggregated amounts through budget and things, but specific prices to specific contracts. And then there's 6 or 7 other types of terms, and then certain provisions are not disclosable and can actually be redacted from our contracts, which are normally publicly available.
Okay, well, thank you, Ryan, for that clarification. This is my first budget as a member of the board, so I appreciate that that little bit of education. But I think my other points in terms of actually identifying, again, breaking down like personnel costs, how many FTEs we have coming into this, how many FTEs we expect to have coming out. These are the kinds of things that we normally see in a more of an expanded budget discussion. I know that's more work. I know that this came out at 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening, so I didn't want to begin to know where everybody was working on a Saturday, but thank you for getting that out. And so does any of that resonate, Dr. Washington, in terms of kind of really starting to build a more robust budget that we can be using as a template going forward now that we're presumably going to a more stabilized operation?
Yeah, it does, Director LaCava, certainly resonates. I believe you made a comment with regard to city budgets are usually a lot more robust and detailed, albeit we, in terms of the number of line items, we would only have a fraction of those. But
Sure.
The point that you drive in terms of providing more detailed descriptions to the extent possible, that's certainly doable, and that does resonate.
Okay, because some of the stuff that we do, again, the way that we have set this organization up does put us in a much more transparent condition. I think you're doing a great job. Again, I don't want anybody to misunderstand. I think we're all kind of, working together on the same page with the same goals and outcomes here. But I think in terms of the degree that we can do that prior to the full board presentation. And there, because there's only us, and I know we're only allowed to have 3, so we're only missing 1. I was thinking about moving this forward without a recommendation, without prejudice. Because it sounds like we're going to get a little more information. We're going to get your accommodation for actually showing where the net proceeds would go. And so we used to be supportive of that. You're comfortable with that? I would even have Dr. Washington weigh in.
Yes, I think to the extent possible, we can certainly add additional color or detail to your point. For example, with the cumulative net position that essentially represents our reserve, we can certainly incorporate a table and narrative around that, as well as giving some more detail about specific line items in the budget to the extent possible. I believe that's certainly doable between now and the time we'd have to put the package forward for the upcoming board meeting.
Okay. And again, I assume this is going to come as an action item, wouldn't be thrown into consent on here.
Oh yes. That's the intent, unless the chair decides otherwise. But that's
Right.
certainly the intent, to have it as a discussion item, actual action item, and not a consent item.
Okay. Well, Chair, I'm going to try that. Move this without a recommendation and without prejudice to the full board for their action.
Thank you, Director Collins.
Good feedback. I agree. Thank you. The committee is doing its due diligence.
There you go.
Understood.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Washington. Great work. I know these annual budgets are not easy to pull together, make estimates, projections going forward. So thank you for that very good work and all the staff that supported you.
Thanks again, Director LaCava. We continue to work collaboratively as a staff and as a team to make sure we can dot every I and cross every T to the extent possible, particularly when dealing with projections. So
yeah, not easy. So okay, I don't have any other questions or comments.
Me neither. Thank you very much. Any committee member announcements? None here as well. It is 3:26. We are adjourned. Thank you all very much.